Namaste and welcome to the Bharat Varta podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. The Indian Railways are the lifeline of the country, connecting various corners of our vast geography. It's the fourth largest network in the world by size. Beyond the immense utility of the railways, there is also a rich cultural and social significance to it. And today we have a very special guest on our show to discuss just that. Ms. Vinita Srivastava is the Executive Director, Railway Heritage, heading the Heritage Directorate of the Railway Board in Rail Bhavan, New Delhi. Vinita ji has spent over 2 decades in rail transportation and was previously posted in the Ministry of Culture. It's a privilege and honor to host you, ma'am. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you. My pleasure entirely. Thank you for having me, Roshan, and a very warm welcome. Happy New Year, Gudi Parva, Ugadi, and also advanced greetings for World Heritage Day, which happens to fall on the 18th upcoming.
Yeah,
so
our good
very
wishes.
Great time to begin this conversation.
Yeah, fantastic. And I must say, it's a very pretty toy train that you have right in front of you. Yeah. So I have also changed my background just to set the context. So there's plenty of things for us to discuss and discover the nuances of. So maybe to begin with, could you talk us through about your involvement with the railways? How did you get started, and what your experience has been like?
Absolutely. I'm a second generation railway woman.
Oh.
Because my mom started her career as a medical doctor in the railway services in Baikula, Mumbai. So practically grown up by the side of the railway tracks, so to say. The professional association begins in 1996 when I started as a special class railway apprentice with the Indian Railways. It's a stream which invites people from the 12th grade onwards to become officer trainees to serve as mechanical engineers. And I've had the proud privilege of various hierarchical levels in the railways, looking after workshops, manufacturing units, research, train operations. It's been an interesting career.
Right. Fantastic. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Just that stint in the Ministry of Culture, as you so kindly mentioned in the introduction, was more of an introduction into what exactly is heritage in the sense of academics. So railways is a part of industrial heritage, and that lens has certainly helped me in what I do now, which is look after museums, railway heritage routes, and various policy issues connected with this.
Right. Yeah, actually, let's talk about that. The role of the heritage wing of the railways itself. What does your department do?
Okay, we are a very small unit from Railway Board, just a handful of officers. But all over the country, we have 34 rail museums, which have vintage rolling stock, memorabilia, nostalgia, everything that has the potential to generate a fondness for railway travel in India. Of course, as policy, this began with its seed germinating in the National Rail Museum, which is in Chanakyapuri, New Delhi. In the 60s, this museum started to collect and showcase vintage rolling stock and basically capture the journey of the Industrial Revolution in India. When the directorate was formed at Railway Board, it was to gather these strands together to make sure that all the museums give a narrative which is nationalistic and futuristic at the same time. The railway is a dynamic heritage. It helps the economic growth of the country. It is an essential component of our transport infrastructure. Heritage helps branding in many intangible ways. And all of that is built into what we look after. Another very vital component of my work is the UNESCO certified heritage railways that we have, the mountain railways, which are glorious 150-year-old systems, still maintained and run in the same way as they were, more or less. And collaborating with UNESCO, the Ministry of Culture, to operate these systems, attract tourism, is also a part of my remit. Yeah.
Right. You mentioned, the museum, the National Rail Museum in New Delhi, and it's quite an interesting place. Are there other museums established in other cities to, promote a love and awareness for what the railways is? Because, as you mentioned, it's so intertwined with our history and culture, right? I mean, it mirrored the Industrial Revolution earlier and so on. So, any plans for other museums in other cities?
Oh, yes. Not too many people know that we have 34 museums and heritage galleries, big and small. Where this little train comes from is, of course, a scale model in 1 in 200 size from the National Rail Museum, New Delhi. As I mentioned, it started in the 1960s. But we have a very beautiful museum attached to the ICF Chennai, the Integral Coach Factory, which showcases the manufacturing setup and the growth of indigenous coach building in India. There's a Mysore Museum, which has the Mysore Heritage Railway record. There is a beautiful heritage gallery, which is part of the erstwhile Victoria Terminus in Mumbai, which celebrates that particular segment of the Grand Indian, the GIPR, the Peninsular Railway. Hubballi, Howrah, and Nagpur for narrow gauge, Ghoom in Darjeeling, heritage galleries in the Nilgiris. So all of them together make up this showcase, nationwide showcase of railway heritage.
Right.
I should share a link perhaps of all our little museums. It's up there on the website. Perhaps at the end of this talk, I will share that link so our viewers can see how many galleries there are actually.
Yeah, that'll be interesting for sure. You also mentioned, different heritage routes in India, right? So if you can talk to us about some of these key routes, whether it's Kalka, Shimla, Darjeeling, and so on, in some detail, and how did also they get that heritage tag to them?
Okay. To understand and to approach this question in the right way, we must understand that Indian Railways, when India gained independence, was a sort of a legacy system. And this very distinct special map of a route network of trains was built with a different purpose, obviously. It was built for the British to transport goods, cotton, opium, whatever it may be, to where they wanted it to go. And perhaps passenger services were a secondary and a later intervention when the crown took over. With that history, the heritage routes we have, all of it was old train routes. Some of it got amalgamated when the railways were nationalized post-independence. So everything became one large Indian railway. And then when the uni-gauge project took over, so a single gauge all over India, then all the more integration. The heritage routes which remained the same more or less and are UNESCO certified are three. You mentioned them, Darjeeling Himalayan Railway, which starts from, say, off Siliguri up until Ghoom, which is the highest station. Similarly, the Kalka Shimla Railway, which is the commonly known as the toy train, that's part of Northern Railway. And down south, from up to Udagamandalam or Uti as we know it, the Nilgiri Mountain Railway. There are two more on the UNESCO heritage list tentative, but because a lot of structures do not maintain their originality, they're still on the tentative list. Those are the Kangra Valley from Pathankot, Joginder Nagar, that section. And another section, which is again a very popular line, the Neral Matheran section near Bombay, a very beautiful scenic journey. If I can flip my screen and show you the UNESCO certification in a moment. That is our description of the mountain railways of India. And the tags were in different times. We celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Darjeeling tag recently. In 2004 and 2007, we got the certifications for the Kalka, Shimla and the Nilgiri sections. Those are our heritage routes in the international sense. Other than that, a very beautiful section in Patalpani Kalakund near Ratlam, which celebrates the indigenous tribes and the forest section of that area. Very scenic routes of Konkan Railway. They count as, because they're so deeply connected with the beauty and the heritage of the region, they can also be termed as heritage and scenic journeys. So all of these are perhaps a part of heritage routes in India.
Right, fantastic. How does the railways ensure that these railway lines are, maintained, managed, and kept intact?
That is a tough one. It certainly costs a substantial amount of money, some perseverance and commitment, and a lot of inputs from stakeholders who want that bit of time travel to sort of be retained. I lost your video. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay. So, heritage routes to maintain, they need care to the vintage rolling stock, which is steam locomotives, the special purpose coaches. A maximum of 2 or 3 can be pulled by that steam engine. The heritage buildings by the wayside, which need to retain their charm and their originality. Even if you repair them, you can't use cement and concrete. You have to use the same materials which they were built with. Similarly, the systems, the signaling systems, the way the station master in his uniform approaches the passengers, all of that old world charm has to be retained in order to present a scenic journey, a picturesque and throwback into time kind of journey to the tourist. So that is authenticity in terms of a period travel experience. When it comes to heritage buildings, especially like the Victoria Terminus or the Kachiguda or other old buildings that we retain in their original structures, then the challenges are slightly different. Each state has its own heritage commissions and its laws, where the architectural monuments are governed by those laws. So the railway also conforms to similar guidelines. For UNESCO sites, we follow the UNESCO guidelines. For the local sites, we follow the state and central guidelines. And we maintain those buildings in a particular way. Stakeholders play a very, very important role. Everybody wants stations to have all the amenities, to be modern and comfortable spaces. But then when it comes to a heritage building, restoration is not always friendly to the crowds and the passengers that throng the stations every day. Similarly, in Darjeeling or the other hill areas, urban pressures are overtaking our routes. So you have somebody who wants to build their house right next to the railway line. That encroachment is not really permissible. The balance between a stakeholder's commitment to keeping the route authentic, the municipality keeping it garbage free and clean, the tourists enjoying the special experience that the heritage journey offers, all of that helps to keep it going.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a lot of work and a lot of intensive care to make sure that these are preserved. Can you also talk about the CSMT, that is the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus UNESCO tag, and how this iconic property is maintained?
Sure, it's one of our proud possessions. And the importance of the building starts from an understanding of the history of how it was built. I talked about how railways was a legacy system built by the British and then taken over by the Crown. So the East India Company and the railway companies, which were privately owned, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they started creating these bits of infrastructure in pockets where it was convenient to them. But when the Crown, the King Emperor, took over the railways of India, at that time there were guaranteed railway companies where a return was assured by the then government, the colonial government. And what started was a railway line Earlier, where the railway met the city, there was just a halt station or maybe a grand facade with nothing much behind it. But at the jubilee of the Empress, then Queen Victoria, a grand spectacle was sought to be created in Mumbai in the form of the Victoria Terminus. We may treat it as the foisting of colonial architecture upon a city which was earlier a very coastal city in that sense. But we must remember that the JJ School of Arts was also set up around that time. Every grill, every mural, every column and ceiling and facade of the Victoria Terminus is rich and abundant with Indian art motifs. There are peacocks, there are birds, there are beautiful Indian flora and fauna which celebrate creativity. So that is the history and the cultural heritage of that building. When this got taken over by Indian Railways, thankfully the beauty of the building was recognized. At present, a very generous grant from the State Bank of India Foundation, the Prince of Wales Foundation, and other CSR efforts of the units in that area helped to restore the building. It has regained most of its former glory. Having said that, yes, when we get lost about the plans, how to repair the wood, how to restore the stone, a lot of the very activist architects, let me say, for want of a better word, in Maharashtra are breathing down our necks to make sure we do a good job in keeping the building as pretty as it was when it was built. So Maharashtra and particularly Bombay, the citizens are very strong and active stakeholders in the upkeep of VT, as it is commonly called.
Right, right, wonderful. As you're mentioning all of these scenic places and describing it, I mean, one can't help feel a certain sense of wanderlust, right? I mean, all of us would love to go to these places, but unfortunately, all of us are tethered to our homes at this point of time. Is there any way of experiencing all of this beauty digitally? You were mentioning briefly about the Google, the museum that you're, the digital museum, right? So, can you talk about that and what plans on that front as such?
Well, sure. When we were setting up this call, it took you all of 3 seconds to pull up that beautiful picture behind you.
Yeah.
And I'm sure one of the sources you found it from was Google. So Mr. Google's been very kind with the Google Arts and Culture project. Perhaps you can see.
Yeah.
This was the end result of a series of panoramic recordings done all over the country on scenic routes, on heritage, archival documents, and other forms of digital records. This was in collaboration with a number of foundations and societies. And it had 4 pillars, the journeys of Indian Railways, the people, the heritage, and the engineer. And so what this project by Google Arts and Culture served to do was to create a digital record of all the intangibles, which, like I said, create a fondness for Indian Railways and propagate the mode of travel by rail rather than as opposed to flights or cars. Why should one travel by rail? What is there to celebrate? What is the nostalgia? What are the special experiences that are only possible by rail? And this is only the beginning of what you term a digital museum. It's not easy to put everything connected to the rail on a digital platform, but this is certainly a beginning.
Rail travel is very experiential in some sense. It's not just a point A to point B kind of a thing, which of course happens, but it can also promote a lot of tourism and so on. So how are we leveraging these heritage railways to promote tourism?
Okay, heritage railways do remain one of our very unique offerings, and the IRCTC, the Indian Railways Corporation for Tourism and Catering, has this as a special, the ticket sales are specially featured on its website. Other than that, we are in touch with several state governments so that the destination can be packaged into the railway offering, so that the core product is not just a train ride, not just a joy train ride, but an entire destination experience which distinguishes the particular hill station from any other hilltop destination town. And so we had a number of speeches recently where the 3 T's of Darjeeling or Siliguri area were mentioned, like tea, tourism, and train. And similarly, the tourist circuits are popularized. Say a Buddhist circuit where Sarnath and Gaya are woven into one journey. And these ways of leveraging rail travel so that you project a railway journey as the best way to connect and to navigate the space that is India and Indian heritage is part of our efforts. The particularly mountain destinations are a little tricky because if I compare it to perhaps the Swiss railway, the Rhaetian or the Albula Bernina trains, those have been branded and packaged together for decades now. So everybody remembers that the Swiss railway is a fantastic experience, but the way that experience was built, we still have to get there. We're not there already. Efforts are being made to have public-private partnerships, to have asset monetization of the unused buildings along the track. So we are in the middle of doing all of that, but perhaps not as leveraged as a European or a foreign heritage railway destination.
Right. How are we, involving some of the private players in this, right? I mean, it could be particular brands or it could be certain, locations, places, and so on. So how are we involving the broader private ecosystem in all of this that we're doing?
So, Roshan, that's a great question indeed. And I'm so glad you used the word brand, because that is actually the key to looking at this whole exercise in a successful and a positive manner. You see, heritage railways abroad, that is where from we draw our inspiration because they are profit making. They may involve an operational subsidy or other forms of state linkages which allow that system to operate as a 100-year-old heritage. So in, again, Switzerland, I have to borrow because it is one of the most successful examples before us. They have branded the train. The Bernina Express is a branded train. To reach it, you have to take a ferry and a ropeway and a little wait in the lap of the mountains where some sound and light shows are put up for you. And then finally, you get to board the train. So the whole experience is built up in layers. We, on the other hand, in India, have really we have the core product. We have the train journey, and like Darjeeling Himalayan Railway is Darjeeling and the Himalayas and the railway. Those 3 components which make up the core are very much with us. But the layers that are built on top, that is where the private sector rightly has a role to play. The stakeholders have a role in strengthening that tourism infrastructure. What are those layers? Those layers are first the experiential part of it. So when you board the train and when you get down from the train, there has to be the greeting and the reception and perhaps the forward linkage to an ecotourism experience or a homestay. All of that still has to be built in. It's not as successful in our case in Indian Railways. The other layer that can certainly be built in is the railway bears most of the expense connected with our heritage railways. We certainly don't make money from these services. But abroad, when you look at it, the Swiss canton, which has become a destination because of this railway, has evolved in lockstep with the railway system. So the revenues from not just the ticketed attractions, but other municipal functions flows back, and the systems go hand in hand and evolve. That is how, starting from perhaps an 87-kilometer long route, it has now become a network across the Swiss mountains of more than 300 kilometers, whereas we are stuck at that little 88-kilometer Darjeeling route. Luckily, the railway in that area is being extended as we speak. The line to Rangpo, which will connect the beautiful land of Sikkim and Darjeeling, Kalimpong, Pelling, all of that will be more or less accessible through a rail network. That has a heritage throwback too. Not many people know that it was the Raja of Sikkim who owned Darjeeling, and the British went and for a few hundred rupees they bought it from him to develop this very British colonial hill station where the troops could recover from ill health. So I guess we're traveling back in time in more ways than one.
Right. I was talking to Rory Sutherland on another podcast, and he's one of the advertising greats, and he always has this example of a bunch of engineers were tasked to make the commute between London to Paris better, and they spent something like $5 billion to make the trains about 40 minutes faster. And he says, that he says that for a fraction of the cost, right? Let's say, you provided free internet or something on the train, or maybe, if you served food and drink on the train, it would be more pleasurable for the passengers, and it would improve the experience overall, right? While we are modernizing the railways, and of course it means cheaper, faster, all of those things, what are some other things that we are doing in order to make this railway experience more enjoyable to people?
I have to begin by asking Rory Sutherland to be a little kinder in our case. No, the linking London to Paris by the Channel Tunnel was an engineering feat in so many ways. Digging undersea, it's an amazing bit of railway work. So any railway person anywhere around the world should be justifiably proud of it. Having said that, services can either take layering and slightly better food, slightly better reception and dispatch, but then they can also take a quantum jump in terms of technology, like the Channel Tunnel or the bullet train or the Shinkansen. What happens is, I'll take you back to an example of a news item that broke in 2016 about a girl in Japan, a teenager called Kana. She was in the Hokkaido district, and a train would stop at her village just to pick her up and take her to school. I wonder if you had seen that a little bit.
Heard of that, yeah.
So all that serves to underline is perhaps the buy-in of the state to train services as a mode of transportation for its citizens. And we mustn't forget that Japan is also the sponsor of very generous loans through the JICA system to develop railway systems and popularize them, high-speed railways all over the world. And so a lot of it depends on the kind of approach that the concerned government takes for railway as a transport system, for railway as a chosen mode of travel. What we can do is, going back to your question, is we can have a sharing of costs, risks, and revenue. But to build that business model takes time and it takes buy-in. Right? I'm not sure if that answers all the parts of your question, but...
Right. I guess it's a more integrated strategy in some sense.
Absolutely. Look, why is there an Audi or a BMW showroom in every major city in India? Because there's a person at the other end wanting to buy one, and there's enough marketing to support it. But if you want a high-end railway service in India, a car is one person, but a railway service is a lot more. So if that buy-in is there and the state's willingness is of course there to support it, and perhaps a bullet train corridor or a high-speed corridor with two cities at both ends, both of whom municipal and citizenry and everybody is willing to have that connect and that sharing and put up the funds for it in partnership with the government railways, which I'm sure it's a model that can work fantastically.
Right. We spoke about Japan and Europe and a few examples, right? So, are there any other international benchmarks that we're, kind of studying to improve our own network and service? A few examples that you can cite from, your experience internationally.
Okay. We are electrifying large parts of the Indian railway network. That learning comes from Europe as well as America, because we realized that rather than burning coal and diesel all along every kilometer of the route, having separate feed of electrical power makes more sense. The railways will always remain a more eco-friendly mode of transportation whenever you compare them to road, because the ecological footprint of a road system and individualized transport by cars will always be more than the railways. And air and waterways cannot be universal simply because of transport geography. So if you keep that whole perspective in mind, railways are here to stay, hopefully. Otherwise, people like me will be out of jobs. But to keep them in tune with what is the demand of the economy and the people who travel by rail is a different challenge altogether. So right now, after COVID, we've started, trains are being restarted based on the demand. I think that's a very healthy trend, because it doesn't, it removes the other social or political or other pressures and allows you to focus on core business. Any transport system will always have to respond to demands of the economy and the people of the nation. But how subsidies flow inwards through it and how they flow out has to be moderated so that the system is also profitable. I think in a very measured, lockstep kind of way, we're moving in the right direction. International examples, you have a president in the US who loves to travel by Amtrak. So I guess that's a great example to quote. There must be something good about the railways if that's happening.
Right. Ma'am, this has been a very interesting conversation, many different fascinating aspects that were touched upon. In closing, before we end the podcast, your thoughts to our listeners on why they should prioritize rail travel, right? I mean, if they haven't been convinced with the 40 odd minutes that we spent talking about all of these things, right? In this day and age, why should someone prioritize rail travel, and how would you encourage them?
More than doling out advice, I would put out a request to the listeners. I've now spent over 20 plus years in the railways and over 2 years now at these heritage mountain destinations. I see two kinds of travelers and tourists. One is the inveterate traveler. I mean, they can buy the same cardigan in New Delhi, but they want to go to Darjeeling to buy a cardigan from that market. And there's another kind of traveler who loves the smell of pine-scented air when it hits their face, who loves the travel by train, who responds to the delicate ecological balance of a mountain and a railway, and realizes the kind of industrial heritage that has been preserved for them to see. Now, the Industrial Revolution, when it began more than 100 years ago, was showcased in India by very few things, perhaps mining, the railways, and the shipbuilding, a little bit of all of that. But we are the prime living example of this important step in development. And Indian Railways particularly has been culturally integrated in an impossibly beautiful way in film, in song, in theater, in the lives of people. So Rajesh Khanna and Sharmila Tagore, or Chaiya Chaiya down south on the Nilgiris.
Yeah.
When India got independence, it made the railways its own, and it used it for a very for the growth of the nation. We provide jobs. It is one of the largest systems. In the recent pandemic, the Kisan Rail, the Shramik Rail, they all proved their usefulness to the nation in so many ways. So when you travel to a heritage railway, try to see it for what it showcases rather than just buy cardigans from the Tibetan market. Yeah.
Right. That's a wonderful note to end the podcast on. Thank you so much again for your time. This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for being a kind listener. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharat Varta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.